All right, this talk will cover the period in the United States from the Civil War to about, well, to the end of World War I. Let's see. The talk will also cover developments in the labor movement as well as developments in the socialist movement, because in a lot of ways they're intertwined. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. And that makes sense, right? The socialism comes out of the working class. It's a working class ideology, and it's our way that we're going to change the world for the better. Prior to the Civil War, the U.S. was largely an agrarian society with a small working class. However, following that war, the U.S. saw a tremendous expansion in the industrial capacity and a remarkable growth in the size of the working class, from a little over 1 million at the end of the Civil War to 6 million by 1900s. The first Continental Railroad was completed in 1869, and while the first Continental Telegraph was built in 1860. Oil was discovered in the U.S. and Pennsylvania in 1859, and of course there was a large increase in steel production caused by the introduction of new methods of making steel and the demands created by the expansion of the rail industry. And of course, by 1890, the U.S. military onslaught against the native nations was largely over, culminating in the Wounded Knee Massacre, where 146 Lakota were slaughtered. Workers became concentrated in heavy industries and massive steel mills. They sprouted up in cities such as Cleveland and Pittsburgh. Chicago became the fastest growing city of that period, increasing in size by a factor of 6. From 1870 to 1900. All of this contributed to the growth of the working class and the growth of the socialist consciousness and ideology. Before the Civil War, the socialist movement was dominated by what are known as utopian socialists. While the thinking of utopian socialists was varied, and while they did not share many common political, social, or economic perspectives, we can still make some generalizations about them. Their ideas were a response to the horrors of capitalism during the period of the Industrial Revolution before the Civil War. They reflected the underdeveloped state of the class struggle of their time, and they saw no need to fight for immediate gains of the working class. They neglected the trade unions and did not see the need to engage in political activity. Consequently, the utopians tended to weaken the emerging trade unions and the radical political parties of that time. They saw no connection between capitalist development, the growth of the working class, the daily class struggle, and the struggle for socialism. They tended to favor things like producer and consumer cooperatives, farmers' granges, and experimental communities and communes. The unprecedented expansion of capitalism after the Civil War severely undermined the cause of the utopians. Small-scale manufacturing gave way to giant, non-competitive, monopolistic industrial enterprises. For farmers, their American dream of endless prosperity, inspired by free land stolen from the native peoples in Mexico, and the fairly decent transportation, disappeared in a flood of mortgages, rising freight rates, falling prices, and vanishing frontiers. For workers, the dream of job security and a rising standard of living gave way to economic recessions and depressions, wage cuts, and unemployment. At the same time, the end of the Civil War saw, for the first time, the establishment of nationally organized parties based upon scientific socialism or Marxism. The competition between utopian and scientific socialism was to begin in earnest over the next several decades as workers and socialists engaged in a battle of ideas. But by the end of the 19th century, the ideas of scientific socialism, broadly speaking, would come to dominate the socialist movement in the United States. After the Civil War, socialists began to organize sections of the International Working Men's Association. A lot of us know that as the First International. The First International was founded in London in 1864 at a meeting of workers and held its first Congress in 1866. In 1872, the headquarters moved to New York City and the organization disbanded in 1876. The first labor federation in the U.S. was the National Labor Union. It was founded in 1866 and dissolved in 1872. It had 70,000 members, 700,000 members at its peak, and it succeeded in winning the passage of a federal law in 1868 that mandated the 8-hour day for federal workers, which I was surprised to read about. The law proved ineffective, of course, that's why we don't hear about it anymore, as federal agencies reduced wages and as the hours were reduced. So even the federal government wouldn't comply with their own law. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Full Employment Act. It succeeded in passing similar laws in other states, such as New York and California, but the laws proved, again, unenforceable or ineffective. Unfortunately, this union campaigned for the exclusion of Chinese workers and urged African Americans to form their own union, which did happen. And that union was called the Colored National Labor Union. It was first led by Isaac Myers, who was later replaced by Frederick Douglass, who became the head of the CNLU in 1872. Myers stated, quote, "For real success, separate organization is not the real answer. The white and colored," I'm using the terminology that was prevalent at the time, "the white and the colored must come together and work together. The day has passed for the establishment of organizations upon color." Another union, the Knights of Labor, was founded in 1869. Its initial demands were for an end to child and convict labor, equal pay for women, a progressive income tax, and the cooperative employer-employee ownership of mines and factories. After 1878, the Knights accepted women and African Americans. It, however, allowed its local organizations or assemblies in the South to practice segregation. Oddly, also, the Knights allowed employers to join. I don't know why they did that. But bankers, doctors, lawyers, I'm sorry, Jerry, stockholders, and liquor manufacturers were excluded because they were considered unproductive members of society.
Jerry would have got a special pass.
Yes, he would have. That was lawyers from back then, you know. Asians were also excluded. Mother Jones, who many of you know or heard about, helped to recruit thousands of women to the Knights of Labor. Lucy Parsons, an African, Native, and Mexican-American labor organizer who fought against the injustices of poverty, racism, and capitalism, was also a member of the Knights of Labor. The Socialists exerted a strong influence, especially among the unorganized workers, particularly during the Depression that followed the Panic of 1873. This depression, which originated in Europe, lasted from 1873 to 1879 and brought an end to the speculative bubble that grew after the Civil War. The bubble intensified itself in the overbuilding of railroads, with the government giving massive land grants and subsidies to the railroad industry. Roughly 35,000 miles of new track were laid between 1866 and 1873, and the railroads were the second largest employer outside of agriculture. Speculators fed huge amounts of money into the industry, causing abnormal growth and overexpansion. It's a theme we keep hearing about. It goes on even today. The largest bank in the U.S., J. Cook and Company, collapsed. Cook was the top investment banker in the U.S., with major investments in railroads. Cook's banks also served as a conduit for federal funding, that is, subsidies to the railroad industry, and it also handled the government's wartime loans during the Civil War. In response to the collapse of 1873, the stock market closed for 10 days. That was a pretty drastic event. Credit dried up, foreclosures and factory shutdowns were common. Of the country's 364 railroads, 89 went bankrupt. 18,000 businesses failed over the next 2 years. Unemployment reached 14% by 1876. And while workers who kept their jobs were employed a mere 6 months out of the year and suffered a 45% cut in their wages to approximately $1 per day. It seems like we're repeating this now.